Well, good evening. Our debate topic for tonight is, did Jesus rise from the dead? Christian and Muslim perspectives. I think we are honored and in for a treat for our two debaters that we have here tonight. A weakness that's often seen in debates is that one side or the other understands their own position very well, but doesn't necessarily understand in any complete sense the other individual's position.
So the Islamic view not only flies in the face of history and scholarship, but also insults God, insults Jesus, and contradicts the Quran. The Christian view, by contrast, honors God, honors Jesus, and is thoroughly grounded in historical facts and careful scholarship. If we agree with David Hume that a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, we should all confess that Jesus died on the cross and rose from the dead, just as he said he would.
Hello again. I begin by praising our Creator and Fashioner, the Creator of the heavens and the earth, asking him to send peace and blessings upon all of his prophets, his messengers, all of the righteous people and saints of all time, on all of us here tonight, our loved ones, our families, and ask him to send peace and prosperity in the world around us. I want to start by giving thanks to not only God, but to all of the people who have made it possible for us to be here tonight. The list, as you know, is very long, so I just second what Amos said before me, and thank all of the people that he already thanked, and also some of the people who have been making life for me comfortable since I got here, picking me up from the airport and so on. So as for the topic tonight, David has given you a very good overview of the Christian position, and he also intimated something about the Muslim position, and that is a reasonable place for me to start at, the Muslim position. I'd like to introduce to you a book by Tarif Khalidi, a Cambridge scholar, a book entitled The Muslim Jesus. And in that book, Tarif Khalidi summarized what we know from the Quran on the whole. He said that in denying the crucifixion, the Quran is in fact denying that the Jews killed him. So that is in a nutshell. Now, if you go into details about that, then we visit the verse, Surah 4, verse 157, where it says that the Jews were claiming, we killed the Messiah, Jesus. And in response to that, the Quran is saying, they killed him not, and they did not crucify him. Now, Muslim scholars have generally taken these to be two things being denied. On the one hand, the Quran is saying, they said, that the Jews did not kill Jesus. And on the other hand, according to them, the Quran is denying that Jesus was ever put on the cross. Here they take crucifixion in its most absolute meaning. Let me backtrack for a moment and say that crucifixion is an ambiguous term, just as the word hanging is in English. If we say that I've hung out my clothing to dry, that's just simply the act of hanging the clothing, right? But if we say that somebody has been hung for his crimes, speaking in the past tense, we mean to refer to the act of hanging as a mode of execution. We mean that the person has been executed. So the term itself is ambiguous. When we say that Jesus was crucified for our sins, what do we mean? We mean that he was killed. Not only that he was hung for a moment or for a few days and taken down alive, but Christians mean that he was hung until he died. And hence the word crucifixion in that context means killed by that particular method that we're referring to as we speak. The Muslim scholars wanted the word crucifixion here to mean it both ways. So the denial for them would be the denial of both things, both that he died on the cross and also that he was ever put on the cross. But I would say that given the context, the way in which the Quran speaks about this, we need to look behind the Quran to see what was the situation that the Quran is commenting upon. In order to understand the Quran, Muslim scholars have explained that we have to look at what they call the asbabun nuzul, or the circumstances of revelation. Usually there is something factual happening on the ground, and the Quran is commenting upon that. So when the Quran is speaking about the crucifixion of Jesus, to deny it, we have to go back in history and ask, what is it that the Quran could be denying? To be sure, the Muslim scholars did this too. What they did was they looked at the gospel reports about how Jesus was arrested and then eventually brought to trial and then eventually put on the cross, and they wanted to find at some point within that longer narrative where somebody could have been substituted to look like Jesus and could have been crucified while everyone thought that they were crucifying Jesus. So they did the same thing, which I'm proposing that we do. But going further and in more detail into the history about Jesus, there seems to be, to me, to be no reason for thinking that somebody else was mixed up and crucified in the place of Jesus. What about the Quranic text? Does the Quranic text itself give sufficient reason for thinking that somebody else was crucified in the place of Jesus? Muslim scholars have pointed to a phrase within that same verse that we're looking at, Surah 4, verse 157, where it says, وَلَكِنْ شُبِّهَ لَهُمْ, and so it was made to appear to them, as Amos read it out earlier on. Now that Arabic phrase actually is an impersonal phrase. Muhammad Asad, explaining this in his commentary on the Quran, said that khuyila li means something has appeared to me. I fancied something. So in the Quranic text, it must mean that while the Jews thought that they were crucifying Jesus, they did not actually crucify him. But what happened? The verse itself ends by saying, وَمَا قَتَلُوهُ يَقِينًا, they did not kill him for certain. Which could mean that while they thought that they had him dead on the cross, in fact, they did not quite kill him. Now, David says, well, there's no reason for thinking that the person would not die by crucifixion. And he, gives us a graphic description, and he gives us like the whip with all of its spikes and so on to convince us that, well, Jesus' flesh must have been torn, maybe his intestines were ripped out even before he went to the cross. But in presenting it that way, David is going by the details in the New Testament, details which are not necessarily attested to by the scholars that he has cited. In other words, critical scholars nowadays do not take the details as they are in the New Testament. For example, Raymond Brown, though a conservative scholar, is well respected across various denominations of Christianity. And in his two-volume work, The Death of the Messiah, he says, we must wonder as to what was the physiological cause of the death of our Lord, because crucifixion pierces no vital organ. Often the crucified victim would be left there for a couple of days, and then he eventually passes out, he dies after he goes into volemic shock. But Jesus was on the cross, by all accounts, only for a few hours, to the extent that when it was reported to Pilate that Jesus died, and a claim was made for his body to be taken down, Pilate marveled that Jesus could have died so soon. So there was a question as to whether Jesus actually did die on the cross. I will elaborate more on this later on. I wasn't planning to include this in my presentation, so in the interest of time, I will continue. But in short, I would say that there are good reasons for thinking that Jesus did not actually die on the cross at the time when the gospel writers say that he died, and possibly he was taken down alive and put into the tomb. And in that case, the Quran could be merely saying, while the Jews thought that they had finished Jesus off by crucifixion, they did not actually finish him off, they did not kill him for certain, but God rescued him and raised him to himself. And so we believe in the ascension. Many Christians will be surprised to know that Muslims do acknowledge that Jesus was raised to heaven. Surah 4, verse 158 says, بَلْ رَفَعَهُ اللَّهُ إِلَيْهِ, but God raised him to himself. And so Muslims and Christians together believe that Jesus is alive and in heaven, that God rescued him. Now I must add, however, that Muslims are of many different persuasions. David showed us the picture of Reza Aslan, and there are many Muslims who approach things differently. Some Muslims take the texts literally, some take texts figuratively and metaphorically. Some Muslims find themselves okay with miracles, especially of a stark kind. Some other Muslims would like to see more scientific explanations, rational processes, by which they understand things. So some Muslims would have the idea that Jesus was raised bodily into heaven, where he somehow is retained by God for his second coming. And some other Muslims might say, well, maybe his soul went into heaven even if his body was left in the grave. Some may say that it doesn't matter, body or soul. When the Quran says that God has raised someone, it may mean that God has exalted that person in position and in status and respect, and it's not necessarily a statement about anything, any aspect of the human person that is somehow lifted up to the sky. So I say that there is this variety of belief among Muslims. I would add, and I hope I'm not presumptuous in saying so, that Christians also are of quite a variety. There are some Christians who insist on the actual bodily resurrection of Jesus. And in that case, some of them think that it's the same body in which he lived on this earth that was somehow metamorphosized to a glorified body, and that one was lifted up. And so the body of Jesus could not possibly have been left in the tomb. Some of the Christians say it doesn't matter if his body was left in the tomb, maybe his spirit was raised into heaven, and that's good enough for us. So there is a variety of beliefs among Muslims, also a variety of beliefs among Christians. And what I want to look for tonight are ways in which Muslims and Christians can talk to each other. I don't want to prove Islam right and Christianity wrong. In fact, I want to prove Christianity right. But in my view, what is most right in Christianity are those aspects which can be retraced to the earliest generation of Christians. And I will attempt to find what were some of those beliefs as regards to our topic here tonight. So let me proceed. I have to say that there has been an evolution in both the texts and in the beliefs of Christians over time. Starting with the texts, there is a book by Marcus Borg, one of the scholars that David just cited, entitled The Evolution of the Word. And what he proposes is precisely what I'm saying, that the texts have actually evolved over time. And let's look at some actual facts regarding this. Now, we see that there are 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John in the Bible, and scholars have grouped them together, saying that we have, on the one hand, John's Gospel, which is a different Gospel, and 3 other Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, meaning that these 3 can be viewed together. They're quite similar. Now, if you go from these Synoptic Gospels to the Gospel according to John, it is widely recognized that there is an evolution in the way that Jesus is presented. Jesus is presented much more glorious in the Gospel according to John. So you can see before your eyes that from the first 3 Gospels to the last one, there is a change. Such a change that James Dunn, one of the scholars that David just cited, said that many people coming to this for the first time will be in shock to see how John presents Jesus after they have already read about Jesus in the Synoptic Gospels. Very different presentation. Now, among the 3, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you can also see that there is a progression. So that whereas in Mark, when the women went to the tomb, they found a young man in the tomb who told them that Jesus is not here. He is risen. Now, in Matthew, what they found is an angel. So we went from a young man to an angel. It's possible that Mark also means an angel, but he specifically said a young man. Now, Matthew makes sure that there is an angel. In Luke, there are 2 angels. So if we go from Mark to Matthew and Luke, we see from Mark, there's a young man, Matthew, an angel, Luke, 2 angels. We're dealing with the very same scenario, the very same event, described differently. You can see that there is a progression over time. Now, evolution, as you know, doesn't always occur in a straight line. If we say that house prices tend to rise over time, there could be ups and downs, but we're talking about the overall trend. And the overall trend is what I'm interested in here. We see that the later the text, the more Christian it becomes. And the earlier the text, would I be presumptuous in saying the more Muslim it is, as you will see over time. So I'm sorry that I have this so low, and I hope that Scott's head won't be in the way here. Scott, sorry to bother you, my friend. Okay, so in Mark, the women left the tomb after this young man spoke to them, and Mark says, trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. And now the problem is that if that's how Mark ended his gospel originally, before other people came and tacked on other passages trying to say that Jesus did appear to his disciples and so on. Now, this is not a very satisfying Christian ending to the gospel, because we want to know more. Well, wait a minute. So he's not here. He's been risen. Where is he? Can we see him? And if the women got this message from the young man, why didn't they tell anybody? And if they didn't tell anybody, how did Mark come to know about it? Some scholars say that Mark is actually saying this apologetically, because by the time he's writing decades later, it may be asked of him, if you're describing the story that the body was taken and there was a young man there in the tomb, how come we never heard about this story before? Because Paul, as David showed us, Paul has this charisma. Jesus was buried and he appeared. Well, where's the empty tomb? Where does he say that the tomb was discovered empty? He doesn't say. Did he know about the empty tomb? There's a question mark about that. But the first written record we have that there was an empty tomb is in Mark's gospel. And the women who discovered the tomb empty didn't tell anybody. So how did Mark know about this? So there are these difficult questions to deal with. So how did the later gospel writers deal with this? Well, Matthew comes along and says, so the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid, yet filled with joy, and ran to tell the disciples. So that's how we knew, because they ran to tell the disciples. So comparing them, you can see that in Mark, they said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. In Matthew, they ran. Yes, they were still afraid, but they were also filled with joy, as you might expect. And then they ran to tell the disciples. So that's how we know. So then we come to Luke, and Luke has done it in his own way. And has still improved it a bit, because not only did they tell the things to the 11, which is the number of disciples remaining after the one betrayed Jesus, but to all the others. So now everybody knows that this is the story. So comparing them, here again we have Mark, so you can see at a glance. Mark said they said nothing to anyone. Luke says they told the 11 and all of the rest. Putting the three together, in summary, in Mark they told nobody. In Matthew, they told the disciples. In Luke, they told the disciples and all of the others. Okay? So we can see that there is a progression over time. The story is becoming more as we go from one gospel to another. So scholars evaluating this have said that Mark was written first, Matthew and Luke later, and that explains why these differences are as they are. Matthew and Luke are improving upon Mark. They have Mark before them. They're copying, but also changing as they go. In terms of dates, Jesus, Muslims believe, has ascended to heaven. The date that is commonly given is 30 CE or even 33 CE. Mark, the earliest possible, scholars say nowadays, was 65. They say 65 to 75, which means 3.5 decades after Jesus left the scene. So in that period of time, people are evaluating the stories, evolving the stories, and then eventually the stories get written as they are. And then Matthew and Luke, another 20 years later, by 85 CE. And then finally, not to forget John by 100 CE. So we have John, for example, written some 60 years after Jesus had already left the scene. Am I right about that? 30 plus 60, 65, 70 years. So the stories evolve and change. And in some, it is important for us to bear in mind that Mark was written first and John was written last. Once you bear that in mind, you will realize that much of what is presented, much of what David argues for, ignores the evolution of the Gospels. And when you read the Gospels with this in mind, you will see that as you go from Mark to John, the number of witnesses increase, the closeness of the witnesses to the cross increase. Think, for example, about the beloved disciple who was there at the foot of the cross in John's Gospel. Why isn't the beloved disciple mentioned in the other Gospels? And not only is he not mentioned at the foot of the cross, but he's not mentioned at all. When at the Last Supper, this beloved disciple is supposedly leaning on the chest of Jesus, so that Peter has to ask through the beloved disciple. In the Synoptic Gospels, Peter asks directly. There's no beloved disciple in sight here in the other Gospels. So it seems that John has invented his own witness and placed him at the scene of the cross so that he could be a witness to whatever is happening. So then he can tell you, oh, well, Jesus was speared in the side, so that must have been the thing that killed him. But now historians think that that spear in the side is not a historical reminiscence at all, and that this is just an invention of the fourth gospel for its own theological purposes. And therefore we cannot, in the end, have any confidence that Jesus actually died on the cross. Now I'd like to introduce you very quickly. I have to move over. There's something here about Paul's writings in between, but I must get back here in the interest of time. So Paul's writing comes in before all of the Gospels. And that accounts for a lot of the influence of Pauline teaching into the Gospels. I'll elaborate on that later on. More importantly, I'd like to introduce you to this book by Daniel Smith. His name is given at the bottom here of the cover page. Postmortem Vindication of Jesus and the Sayings Gospel Q. Daniel Smith has advanced a remarkable thesis which was known before him, that Jesus, according to a very early Christian proclamation, was actually raised into heaven from the tomb. He was assumed into heaven, not that he came out of the tomb, met with his disciples, and then finally ascended, but I'll elaborate on that in the later segments. Thank you all very much for your patient listening.